On February 15, 1978, a Pensacola police officer ran the plates on a slowly crawling orange Volkswagen Beetle and discovered the car was stolen. The driver gave a fake name, but an FBI fugitive flyer sitting in the patrol car told a different story. According to a 2018 retrospective that quoted the original arresting officer's report, the officer on duty that night was David Lee, and the man behind the wheel withheld his real identity for close to 2 days. The FBI's own account confirms that Bundy was pulled over in Pensacola, that he initially concealed who he was, and that the fugitive flyer was instrumental in the identification. Whether those details unfold exactly as described in the retrospective, or slightly differently in the original report, the outcome was the same. A man who had slipped through the hands of multiple states was finally in custody. But custody alone did not close the case. What came before the arrest, and what prosecutors built in the months after, is the story that actually matters. You might wonder why a stolen car stop in a Florida panhandle city was the beginning of the end. It is a fair question. Bundy had already been convicted in Utah, had escaped from a Colorado courthouse, had escaped again from a jail cell, and had been placed on the FBI's 10 Most Wanted list. He was not unknown. What Pensacola did was remove the one condition that made every other investigative step theoretical. It made prosecution possible. You cannot try a man you cannot find. The arrest converted years of multi-state investigative work, traffic stops, convictions, forensic evidence, and interagency cooperation into a legal case that could finally move to trial. To understand how investigators got there, you have to go back 3 years. In August 1975, Utah police pulled Bundy over in his Volkswagen and found a collection of items that drew immediate suspicion. Handcuffs, a length of rope, and a ski mask, according to the FBI's historical account of the case. That stop did not solve a series of disappearances. Possession of those items was an investigative lead, not proof of any specific crime. But it put Bundy inside an investigative record for the first time, in a way that was difficult to walk away from. Investigators were, at that point, working across multiple jurisdictions with missing persons cases and incomplete evidence. The Utah stop gave them something concrete: a man, a car, physical objects, and a name. What they did not yet have, and would spend the next several years assembling, was a prosecutable chain of evidence. Every major development in this story begins with that gap between what investigators suspected and what they could actually prove in a courtroom. The Utah case did eventually produce a conviction. The Utah Supreme Court's published opinion confirms that Bundy was charged and convicted of aggravated kidnapping in a case involving a teenage victim who survived, a young woman who had managed to escape from him. The conviction was affirmed on appeal. That outcome mattered enormously because it meant Bundy was no longer just a suspect. He was a convicted offender in custody, and he was being extradited to Colorado to face a murder charge. For investigators who had been tracking disappearances across the western United States for years, this was the first time the legal system had formally closed around him. It would not hold. But the record it created, a name, a conviction, a case number, would follow Bundy every step of the way. On June 7, 1977, Bundy was being held in Aspen, Colorado, awaiting trial in the murder of Karen Campbell, a case identified in FBI files as connected to the Snowmass resort area in January 1975. He jumped from a third-story window at the Pitkin County Courthouse, approximately 30 feet, according to the FBI vault's scanned case files, and disappeared into the mountains. He was recaptured in Aspen a few days later. The Colorado judgment from that period could not be fully verified through the sources reviewed for this film, and we will not state a conviction or sentence that the record does not confirm. What the escape did establish, beyond any dispute, is that the system holding Bundy was brittle. A man charged with murder had literally walked out of a courthouse. The question of how he would eventually be stopped for good had not yet been answered. 6 months later, on December 31st, 1977, Bundy was gone again, this time from a jail cell in Glenwood Springs, Colorado. The FBI's account describes how he slipped through an opening in the ceiling of his cell and exited through the jailer's office. It was New Year's Eve. The next morning, he was not there. What followed was the most organized federal response yet. The FBI placed Bundy on its 10 most wanted fugitives list on February 10, 1978. It produced wanted posters, processed latent fingerprints, provided behavioral analysis support, and coordinated across state lines. One of the materials distributed was the fugitive flyer that would appear 5 days later in a Pensacola patrol car. Think about what that distribution effort actually required. A sustained, multi-agency campaign to put a specific man's face in front of as many law enforcement officers as possible, in as many jurisdictions as possible, before he hurt anyone else. It almost worked in time. What happened next in Florida showed that almost was not enough. On January 15, 1978, more than 3 weeks before the Pensacola arrest, an intruder entered the Chi Omega sorority house adjacent to Florida State University in Tallahassee. What followed is documented in the Florida Supreme Court's later opinion. Margaret Bowman and Lisa Levy were killed. Kathy Kleiner and Karen Chandler survived serious assaults. Within roughly an hour, Cheryl Thomas was attacked at a nearby residence. 5 victims, in 2 locations, in a single early morning. The attacks were swift and they were brutal, and investigators arriving at the Chi Omega house faced a crime scene with multiple victims, no identified suspect, and a community in genuine panic. Florida State University is not a small campus, and the surrounding neighborhood had no way of knowing that the person responsible was already on a federal wanted list. The connection between the fugitive named on that FBI poster and the intruder inside that sorority house was not immediately obvious. Building it, turning a violent scene into a prosecutable case against a specific person, required exactly the kind of patient, layered investigative work that defines this story. How did they build that connection? One witness and one piece of evidence at a time. In the days and weeks after January 15th, investigators worked to reconstruct what had happened inside the Chi Omega house and at Cheryl Thomas's nearby residence. The connections between the 2 attacks, the timing, the proximity, the nature of the assaults, pointed strongly toward a single perpetrator. The Florida Supreme Court's 1984 opinion, decided on Bundy's appeal, reviewed the evidence that investigators assembled: the physical state of the scenes, the victim injuries, and the forensic samples collected. One of those samples would turn out to be significant, though no one yet knew how significant. During the examination of Lisa Levy's body, investigators documented bite marks, distinct, patterned injuries that forensic examiners believed could be matched to a specific individual. That evidence sat in the record while investigators worked a parallel track, locating the eyewitness who had been inside the building that night, who had seen the intruder, and who might be able to identify him once they had a suspect in custody. Nita Neary was returning to the Chi Omega house in the early morning of January 15th, when she saw a man at the front door. She described what she observed to police: a figure carrying an object she described as a log with a cloth or stocking wrapped around it, and a profile she had clearly seen. The Florida Supreme Court's opinion records that she gave investigators a description, later identified Bundy in a photographic lineup, and identified him again in court. Did her identification prove guilt beyond dispute? The defense argued at trial that the conditions were difficult, that her view was brief, and that eyewitness memory is inherently imperfect. Those arguments were real, and they deserve acknowledgement. What you cannot set aside is that Neary was there. She saw someone, and she identified the same man consistently across multiple settings. The prosecution's case needed her testimony. It also needed something more: evidence that no defense attorney could attribute solely to the fallibility of human memory. Forensic odontologist Richard Suviran took the stand and presented something the jury had not seen in a Florida criminal trial before: a direct comparison between bite marks on Lisa Levy's body and dental impressions and photographs taken from the defendant. His conclusion was that the marks matched Bundy's teeth. A second forensic dentist, using computer-enhanced photographs, reached the same conclusion. The Florida Supreme Court later reviewed both sets of testimony and upheld their admission. But here is what you need to understand about that evidence. Bite mark comparison was a recognized forensic technique in 1979, and the courts accepted it. The defense countered that at least 4 different sets of teeth could have made the same marks, a challenge the jury heard and rejected. In the decades since the trial, bite mark analysis as a discipline has faced serious scientific scrutiny, and modern forensic review has raised substantial questions about its reliability as an identification tool. The Florida conviction rests on a jury verdict affirmed by the state's Supreme Court. It does not rest on forensic science the broader scientific community has since treated as settled. Both of those things are true at the same time. Bundy's defense attorneys challenged every pillar of the state's case. They questioned Nita Neary's ability to reliably identify anyone under the conditions she described. They argued the bite mark methodology was speculative. They pushed on the absence of direct physical evidence linking Bundy to the entry of the building itself. The Washington Post's contemporaneous trial coverage reflects a defense team that understood exactly what it was doing. What the trial record does not establish, and what this film will not claim, is that the Florida verdict adjudicated every disappearance ever associated with Bundy's name. The jury convicted him of what was charged. Later, Bundy made statements about other victims, but confessions made years after the fact, without corroborating case records, do not transform suspicion into proven fact. The convictions stand on their own evidentiary record, and that record has real limits. The trial opened in Miami in July 1979. The prosecution presented Nita Neary's eyewitness identification and the bite mark testimony from 2 forensic dentists as its central pillars, surrounded by the physical evidence from both attack sites and the pattern connecting Chi Omega to Cheryl Thomas's residence. The defense challenged both. The jury deliberated, and the verdict came on July 24, 1979. The New York Times reported it the following day: guilty of murdering Lisa Levy and Margaret Bowman. The Florida Supreme Court's opinion confirms the full judgment: 2 first-degree murder convictions, 3 convictions for attempted first-degree murder, and 2 burglary convictions. The trial judge imposed death sentences for both murders. This was not an inevitable outcome from the moment the Pensacola officer stopped that Volkswagen. It required an eyewitness who held firm under cross-examination, a forensic discipline the court accepted, and a prosecutorial team that knew how to present a complicated, multi-site case to a jury. The chain of events that produced those verdicts was long, and every link had to hold. So what actually closed the case against Ted Bundy? It was not one arrest. It was not one witness. It was not one piece of forensic evidence. It was a chain, and every link in that chain was necessary. A Utah traffic stop created an investigative record. An aggravated kidnapping conviction put Bundy formally inside the legal system. 2 escapes from custody triggered the national fugitive campaign that put his face in patrol cars across the country. A stolen Volkswagen stop in Pensacola ended the flight. And then, in a Miami courtroom, a prosecution team combined an eyewitness who would not be shaken with physical evidence the court accepted and asked a jury to see the entire chain at once. The case was closed through identification, custody, interagency cooperation, eyewitness testimony, forensic evidence, and courtroom strategy working together. Remove any one of those elements, and the verdict is not the same. What you are watching, across the full arc of this investigation, is not a story about a single breakthrough. It is a story about what it actually takes to close a case, and why that almost never happens quickly.